The invitation arrived on a Tuesday morning in October, slipped between the electric bill and a grocery store flyer like it belonged there, cream-colored cardstock with gold lettering that caught the kitchen light just so. Mr. Richard Thompson cordially invites you to celebrate the marriage of Michael Thompson and Sarah Elizabeth Collins. I set my coffee mug down harder than I meant to, the ceramic ringing against the old oak table Margaret and I had bought at an estate sale 30 years ago. The same table where we'd eaten breakfast every morning until cancer took her 2 winters back, where I still ate breakfast, alone now, with the empty chair across from me, serving as a daily reminder of how quiet a house can become. Michael was getting married again. I read the invitation twice, running my thumb along the embossed border. Saturday, November 18th. 4 o'clock ceremony, reception to follow. No church listed, no specific address, just Riverside Gardens, Springfield. The kind of vague location that meant nothing to someone who didn't already know exactly where to go. My first marriage had been different. Margaret and I were married at St. Paul's Methodist, the same church where her grandmother had been baptized, where her parents had exchanged vows 40 years before us. The invitation had listed everything, the full address, the pastor's name, even directions from the highway for out-of-town guests. We'd spent weeks addressing envelopes by hand, Margaret's careful script, flowing across each one like water finding its level. I walked to the living room, invitation still in my hand, and stopped before the mantel where our wedding photo sat in its silver frame. Margaret in her grandmother's dress, pearls at her throat, eyes bright with the kind of joy that photographs can capture but never quite contain. Me in a rented tuxedo that fit poorly at the shoulders, grinning like I'd won something precious and couldn't believe my luck. That was 1978. Michael had been born 2 years later, arriving 3 weeks early on a snowy February morning that had me sliding sideways down icy roads to reach the hospital in time. I'd held him for the first time in a delivery room that smelled of disinfectant and new beginnings, this small red creature with Margaret's nose and my stubborn chin. The boy in that memory seemed impossibly distant from the man who had sent this invitation. When was the last time we'd spoken? Christmas, maybe. A stilted phone call where we'd covered the weather, his job at the insurance company, my retirement projects around the house. Surface things, safe things, the kind of conversation you have with a stranger you're trying to be polite to. I carried the invitation to the kitchen and propped it against the sugar bowl, studying it while I finished my coffee. Something nagged at me, a splinter of wrongness I couldn't quite locate. The paper felt expensive, professional, the kind of thing Sarah would insist on. She'd always had particular tastes about presentation, about how things should look, but the details seemed sparse, almost deliberately vague. The garage had always been my refuge, the place where I could think with my hands. After Margaret died, I'd spent countless hours there, restoring an old Mustang that would probably never run again, organizing tools that were already organized, finding purpose in the rhythm of small repairs. The concrete floors were stained with decades of oil changes and weekend projects, the workbench scarred from years of use. I pulled the cord for the overhead fluorescent, wincing as it flickered to life with its familiar electrical buzz. The invitation was still in my back pocket, its presence somehow heavier than its actual weight. I'd been working on the Mustang's carburetor for months now, a puzzle of metal and precision that demanded attention but offered no deadlines, no expectations beyond my own satisfaction. Michael had loved this garage once. Summer afternoons when he was 8, 9, 10 years old. He'd stand beside me holding flashlights, handing me wrenches, asking endless questions about how engines worked, why carburetors needed cleaning, what made cars run. His small fingers were always dirty by the time Margaret called us in for dinner, grease under his nails like badges of honor. "Dad, why do you like fixing things?" he'd asked once, maybe when he was 12, his voice cracking at the edges as puberty began its awkward work. "Because things that are broken don't have to stay that way," I'd told him, running a rag over my hands. "Most of the time, they just need someone who cares enough to figure out what went wrong." He'd nodded solemnly, the way children do when adults offer wisdom that sounds important, even if they don't fully understand it yet. That boy would have been excited about a wedding invitation. He would have called immediately, breathless with details, wanting to share everything. This invitation felt different, distant, like an afterthought. I set down my wrench and pulled the card from my pocket again, holding it under the bright work light. The date was clear enough. November 18th. But something about the timeline bothered me. Sarah had mentioned an engagement when we'd run into each other at the grocery store last month. But she'd been vague about timing, talking about sometime next year, in that airy way she had when she didn't want to commit to specifics. November 18th was less than 3 weeks away. Short notice for a wedding, especially for someone like Sarah, who planned dinner parties with military precision. Margaret used to joke that Sarah could organize a state dinner with 6 months' notice, but would have a nervous breakdown if you asked her to decide what to have for lunch. The fluorescent light buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the workbench. I folded the invitation carefully and slipped it back into my pocket. Whatever was happening here, it wasn't adding up. And Richard Thompson hadn't survived 72 years by ignoring when the numbers didn't make sense. Back in the kitchen, I poured fresh coffee and stood at the window overlooking the backyard. Margaret's rose garden was mostly dormant now, the bushes cut back for winter, but I could still see the careful pattern she'd planned, the way each variety complemented the others in color and bloom time. She'd spent 15 years perfecting that garden, adjusting and replanting until it was exactly what she'd envisioned. Gardens take patience, she'd told me once, kneeling in the dirt with her hands deep in dark soil. You plant something and trust that it'll grow the way it's supposed to. But sometimes you have to accept that what you planted isn't what you're going to get. I wondered what she would think of this invitation, this strange formal announcement that felt more like an obligation than an invitation. Margaret had always been better at reading people than I was, better at seeing the currents underneath the surface. She would have known immediately what was bothering me about those sparse details, that deliberate vagueness. The kitchen clock ticked steadily above the sink, marking time with the same reliability it had maintained for 30 years. Nearly noon. Michael would be at work, probably in some glass-walled conference room, discussing risk assessments and policy adjustments. I could call him there, interrupt whatever meeting he was in, ask about the invitation directly. But something held me back. Maybe it was pride, or maybe it was the growing certainty that this conversation wouldn't go the way I hoped it would. Michael had been different since Margaret died, more distant, as if her absence had severed some essential connection between us. The few times we'd talked, he'd seemed impatient, eager to end the conversation and return to whatever more important business was waiting. I walked to the living room and settled into my reading chair, the leather worn soft from years of evening newspapers and Sunday crosswords. The invitation lay on the side table next to yesterday's mail, innocuous enough, but somehow demanding attention like a small fire that wouldn't quite go out. The afternoon sun slanted through the front windows, warming the room in the way that October light does, golden and melancholy at the same time. This had been Margaret's favorite time of the day, when she'd sit in her own chair with her knitting, needles clicking softly as she worked on sweaters for grandchildren we'd never had, scarves for church charity drives, the endless small projects that kept her hands busy and her heart occupied. Her chair sat empty now, positioned exactly as she'd left it, the pale blue afghan she'd been working on still folded neatly on the arm. I couldn't bring myself to move it, couldn't disturb the precise arrangement she'd maintained. Some mornings, I still set out 2 coffee cups before remembering, and some evenings, I still found myself listening for the sound of her key in the front door. The phone rang, startling me out of my reverie. I let it ring 3 times before walking to the kitchen to answer, partly hoping whoever it was would give up and call back later. Dad? Michael's voice carried the slightly strained quality it had developed over the past couple of years, like he was making an effort to sound warmer than he felt. I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time. Never a bad time to hear from you, I said, settling against the counter. The invitation seemed to pulse with importance from the living room, demanding acknowledgement. I got your invitation this morning. Silence stretched across the line, long enough that I wondered if we'd been disconnected. Then, oh, good. I wasn't sure it would reach you in time. In time for what? The wedding's in 3 weeks. Another pause, shorter this time, but no less uncomfortable. Yes, well, we wanted to keep things simple. Small ceremony, just close family and friends. I turned to look out the kitchen window, watching a cardinal search for seeds in Margaret's dormant flower bed. Riverside Gardens in Springfield. I don't think I'm familiar with that venue. It's a newer place. Sarah found it online. Very intimate setting. The cardinal flew away. a flash of red against the gray October sky. And the reception's there too? Yes, everything in one location. Makes it easier for everyone. His voice had that careful quality it got when he was choosing his words more precisely than usual, the way he used to sound when he was 16 and explaining why he was home past curfew. I'd learned to recognize that tone, to know that whatever explanation followed would be technically true, but incomplete. That's thoughtful, I said. Sarah always was good at organizing things. She is. She's handling most of the details. We fell into another silence, this one stretching until it became awkward. I found myself wondering when talking to my son had become such careful work, when every conversation required navigation around topics that might cause discomfort. Well, I said finally, I'll plan on being there. 4 o'clock, you said? Yes, 4 o'clock. He cleared his throat. Dad, about that. There might be some logistics we need to work out. Sarah's parents are handling a lot of the arrangements, and they have some specific ideas about how they want things to go. Something cold settled in my stomach. What kind of logistics? Just seating arrangements, that kind of thing. Nothing major. We'll figure it out. The kitchen suddenly felt smaller, the walls pressing closer. I'd attended enough weddings to know that seating arrangements weren't usually something that required extensive figuring out, especially for close family members. I see, I said, though I didn't see it all. Well, just let me know what you need from me. I will. And Dad, thanks for understanding. I know this is all pretty last minute. After he hung up, I stood in the kitchen holding the dead phone, staring at nothing in particular. The conversation had left me with more questions than answers, and the invitation on the living room table seemed to mock me with its elegant vagueness. I walked back to my chair and picked up the card again, reading it for the 4th or 5th time. The printing was flawless, professional, expensive, but now that I looked more carefully, I noticed what wasn't there. No RSVP information, no mention of gifts, no wedding website, which seemed to be mandatory for couples these days. Just the basic information, spare and formal and somehow incomplete. The afternoon wore on, shadows lengthening across the hardwood floors Margaret had insisted on refinishing herself, back when her knees could still handle that kind of work. I tried to read, tried to focus on the newspaper, but my attention kept drifting back to that cream-colored card and the growing certainty that something was very wrong with this picture. By evening, I'd made up my mind. Tomorrow, I'd start making some phone calls of my own. Richard Thompson had been investigating problems for 7 decades, first in the Army and then in 30 years of insurance work. I knew how to find information when information didn't want to be found. And if my son was lying to me about his own wedding, I was going to find out why. The kitchen light cast long rectangles across the floor as I heated leftover soup for dinner, eating standing up at the counter the way Margaret had never let me do when she was alive. Outside, the wind was picking up, rattling the windows in their frames, carrying the smell of wood smoke from someone's fireplace, and the promise of the first hard freeze. I washed my bowl and set it in the drain rack, then walked through the house turning off lights, checking locks, performing the small rituals that marked the end of another day. In the living room, I paused before Margaret's photograph, studying her face in the lamplight. "Something's not right here, Maggie," I said quietly. "Our boy's up to something, and I don't think it's anything good." The house settled around me with its familiar creaks and sighs, the sounds of wood and plaster adjusting to the cooling air. Upstairs, I could hear the faint whistle of wind through the attic vents, a sound that had lulled me to sleep for 40 years, but now seemed lonelier than it used to. I turned off the lamp and climbed the stairs to bed, leaving the invitation on the side table where it would catch the morning light. Tomorrow would bring answers, one way or another, and if my son thought he could manage his old man with vague explanations and careful omissions, he was about to learn just how wrong he was. Richard Thompson might be 72 years old, but he wasn't anybody's fool, and he was tired of being treated like one. I woke before dawn, the way I had every morning since retiring from the insurance company 5 years ago. The bedroom was still dark, but my internal clock had decided that 5:47 a.m. was the proper time to start the day, regardless of how I felt about it. Margaret used to tease me about this, calling me her rooster, saying I was more reliable than any alarm clock she'd ever owned. The shower water took longer to warm up than it used to, another small sign that the house was aging along with me. I stood under the spray thinking about the phone call with Michael, replaying his careful words, the pauses that felt like editing in real time. In 30 years of investigating insurance claims, I'd learned to listen for what people weren't saying as much as what they were. Michael had been holding something back, choosing his words like a man walking through a minefield. Downstairs, I made coffee strong enough to wake the dead and sat at the kitchen table with yesterday's newspaper. Though my attention kept wandering to the cream-colored invitation propped against the sugar bowl. In the morning light, it looked even more suspicious than it had the day before. Too formal for a son writing to his father. Too sparse for a woman like Sarah, who usually included every possible detail about every possible thing. By 8 o'clock, I was dressed and ready to make some calls. First, I tried information for Riverside Gardens in Springfield, figuring any legitimate wedding venue would have a listed number. Nothing. Then I tried the Springfield Chamber of Commerce, asking if they had any information about wedding venues in the area. Riverside Gardens? The woman on the phone sounded genuinely puzzled. "I'm sorry, sir, but I don't show anything by that name in our member directory." "Are you sure about the name?" I read her the information exactly as it appeared on the invitation. Another dead end. Next, I called my neighbor Frank Morrison, who'd lived 3 houses down for the past 15 years, and had become something of a friend after Margaret passed. Frank was retired military, a Vietnam veteran with the kind of practical skepticism that comes from seeing too much of the world's nonsense in uniform. More importantly, he had a computer and knew how to use it better than I did. "Richard," he said when he answered, his voice carrying the slight rasp of a man who'd smoked for 40 years before his wife made him quit. "Early for you to be calling. Everything all right?" "Frank, I need a favor. Can you look something up on that computer of yours?" "Depends what you're looking for." I explained about the invitation, about the venue that didn't seem to exist. Frank listened without interrupting, the way good soldiers do when they're gathering intelligence. "Give me 20 minutes, he said. "I'll call you back." While I waited, I walked out to the garage and stood among the familiar smells of motor oil and metal, trying to make sense of what I was uncovering. The Mustang sat under its tarp like a patient old friend, waiting for me to figure out its carburetor problems. Simple mechanical issues I could understand. This situation with Michael felt more complicated than any engine I'd ever worked on. Frank called back in 15 minutes. "Richard, you sitting down?" "Should I be?" "There's no Riverside Gardens in Springfield. Not in any Springfield within 200 miles of here. I checked wedding venue websites, Google Maps, even the Better Business Bureau. Nothing." The garage suddenly felt colder. I pulled out one of the old metal folding chairs I kept for her when I needed to think and sat down heavily. "You sure about that?" "Dead sure. But, Richard, there's something else. I got curious and started looking around online for your son and his fiancée. Found some social media profiles, photos, that kind of thing. I waited, though every instinct told me I wasn't going to like what came next. The photos I found are recent, from last weekend. They're already married, been married for at least a week, maybe longer. There are pictures from what looks like a real wedding ceremony, some kind of destination thing. Beach, palm trees, the whole 9 yards. Small group, maybe 20 people total. The folding chair creaked as I leaned back, processing this information. My son had gotten married without telling me, without inviting me. The invitation in my kitchen wasn't for a wedding that was going to happen. It was for something else entirely. "You still there, Richard?" "I'm here. Frank, can you print out some of those photos for me?" "Already did. I'll bring them over." 20 minutes later, Frank knocked on my back door, carrying a manila folder and wearing the expression of a man delivering bad news he wished he didn't have to deliver. We sat at my kitchen table, the fake invitation between us like evidence in a trial. The photos were worse than I'd expected. Michael in a white shirt and khakis, barefoot on a beach somewhere tropical. Sarah in a simple white dress, flowers in her hair, both of them laughing at something outside the camera's range. Her parents were there, tanned and smiling. Several people I didn't recognize. The kind of intimate ceremony that costs serious money, but looks effortlessly casual. "When were these taken?" I asked, though I already knew I wouldn't like the answer. Based on the timestamps and what I could piece together from the posts, looks like last Tuesday, October 10th. 8 days ago. While I was working in the garage, replacing spark plugs and thinking about winter preparations, my son was getting married on a beach somewhere without bothering to mention it to his father. I set the photos down carefully, lining them up like playing cards. So, this invitation is fake, or at least it's not for the wedding it claims to be. Frank left me alone with the photos and the growing understanding that my son had been lying to me more comprehensively than I'd thought possible. The invitation wasn't just vague or poorly planned, it was a deliberate deception. But why? What was the point of sending me a fake wedding invitation? I spent the rest of the morning in my reading chair, staring at the photos and trying to make sense of the timeline. The beach wedding looked expensive, the kind of thing that required months of planning. Sarah's dress alone probably cost more than some people's cars. This wasn't a last-minute elopement. It was a carefully orchestrated event that had deliberately excluded me. The phone rang just after noon. Michael again. "Dad, I wanted to follow up on our conversation yesterday, about the logistics I mentioned." I set the photos on the side table, face down. "What kind of logistics, son?" "Well, Sarah's parents have been very generous with the wedding planning, and they have some strong feelings about how they want the day to go. They're concerned about having too many people from my side of the family there." "Too many people? You mean me?" "It's not personal, Dad. They just want to keep things intimate. Immediate family only." I picked up one of the beach photos, studying my son's face. He looked happy in the picture, genuinely relaxed in a way I hadn't seen in years. Whatever this phone conversation was about, it wasn't about including me in anything. "Immediate family," I repeated. "And I don't qualify?" "You do, of course you do. It's just complicated. Sarah's parents are paying for everything, and they feel like they should have some say in the guest list." The lie was so casual, so smoothly delivered, that I almost admired the craftsmanship. If I hadn't seen the photos, I might have believed him. Might have spent the next 3 weeks preparing for a wedding that didn't exist, buying a new suit, practicing what I'd say to people I'd never met. "Michael," I said quietly, "where exactly is Riverside Gardens located?" I was trying to look up directions. Another pause, longer this time. It's a little hard to find. Very exclusive. They prefer not to advertise their location too widely. But you can give me the address." I'll send it to you later. Sarah has all those details. Or I could call Sarah myself, save you the trouble." "No!" The word came out sharper than he'd intended. "No, that's not necessary. She's very busy with last-minute preparations. I'll take care of it." After he hung up, I sat in the kitchen holding the dead phone, feeling something cold and hard settling in my chest. It wasn't just anger, though there was plenty of that. It was disappointment so profound it felt like grief. The boy I'd raised, the one who'd helped me in the garage and asked endless questions about how things worked, had grown into a man who could lie to his father with practiced ease. I walked to the mantel and picked up Margaret's photograph, studying her face in the afternoon light. "He's lying to me, Maggie. Our boy is lying about his own wedding, and I don't understand why." The house was quiet around me, filled with the kind of silence that amplifies every small sound. The refrigerator's hum, the tick of the kitchen clock, the settling of old wood in changing weather. Sounds that had provided the background soundtrack to 40 years of marriage and 2 years of widowhood. I set the photograph back in its place and returned to the kitchen table, spreading out the beach photos like I was solving a puzzle. There had to be a reason for the fake invitation, some purpose behind the elaborate deception. Michael wasn't cruel by nature, at least the boy I remembered wasn't. But people change, circumstances change, and sometimes the people we think we know best are the ones capable of surprising us in the worst possible ways. The afternoon shadows grew longer as I sat there, trying to piece together a strategy. In the insurance business, when you suspected fraud, you didn't confront the perpetrator immediately. You gathered evidence first, built a case, made sure you understood the full scope of what you were dealing with before you made your move. This felt like fraud of a different kind, but the principle was the same. I needed to understand what Michael was really planning before I decided how to respond. And if my son thought he could manipulate his old man with fake invitations and careful lies, he was about to learn that Richard Thompson still had a few tricks of his own. By evening, I'd made up my mind about the first step. Tomorrow, I'd drive to the county courthouse and check the marriage records. If Michael and Sarah had gotten married last week, there would be paperwork, legal documentation that couldn't be faked or explained away. I heated another can of soup for dinner, eating it while standing at the kitchen window and watching the last light fade from the sky. October was always Margaret's favorite month, when the leaves turned and the air carried the promise of winter. She used to say it was a month for transitions, for accepting that some things had to end so other things could begin. Looking at the fake invitation propped against the sugar bowl, I wondered what was ending here, and what was about to begin. But whatever it was, I intended to face it with my eyes open and my facts straight. Richard Thompson might be getting older, but he wasn't ready to be anybody's fool, and he was done pretending not to notice when the people he loved were lying to his face. The phone rang again just as I was washing my soup bowl. This time, it was a number I didn't recognize. "Mr. Thompson, this is Janet Collins, Sarah's mother." I set down the dish towel and leaned against the counter. "Mrs. Collins, how nice to hear from you. I hope I'm not calling at an inconvenient time. I wanted to discuss the upcoming wedding with you." "Of course. What can I help you with?" Her voice carried the carefully modulated tone of someone who'd practiced this conversation. "Well, as you know, we've been working very hard to create the perfect day for Michael and Sarah, and we feel it's important that everyone understand their role in making that happen." "Their role?" "Yes. You see, this is really Sarah's day, and we want to make sure nothing overshadows that. We've planned everything very carefully, and we'd hate for any misunderstandings to cause problems." I picked up the fake invitation, running my thumb along its edge. "What kind of misunderstandings?" "Oh, you know how family dynamics can be. People sometimes have different ideas about how things should go. We just want to make sure everyone's on the same page." "And what page is that, Mrs. Collins?" A pause, brief but telling. "Well, for instance, we understand you might want to give a speech at the reception, or participate in some of the traditional father activities. But we've already planned those elements, and we think it would be best if we kept the program as simple as possible." The kitchen suddenly felt very small. "I see. I hope you understand. We're not trying to exclude you exactly. We just want everything to go smoothly." "Mrs. Collins," I said quietly, "can you tell me exactly where Riverside Gardens is located? I'd like to make sure I know how to get there." Another pause, longer this time. "Oh, Sarah handles all those details. I'm sure she'll send you the information soon." After she hung up, I stood in the kitchen staring at the phone, pieces of the puzzle beginning to click into place. The fake invitation, the vague venue, the careful conversations about logistics and family dynamics. Michael and Sarah were already married, but they were planning some kind of event for November 18th, and that event, whatever it was designed to humiliate me. I didn't know the details yet, but I could feel the shape of it forming, some kind of public embarrassment, orchestrated by Sarah's parents and enabled by my son. The kind of cruel performance that would leave me standing alone while everyone else was in on the joke. The boy who'd once helped me fix carburetors and asked earnest questions about how engines worked had become a man capable of setting his own father up for public humiliation. And that realization hurt worse than anything I'd felt since Margaret died. But Richard Thompson hadn't survived 72 years by giving up when things got complicated. If my son wanted to play games, he was about to discover that his old man knew a few rules he'd never learned. The war was just beginning. The county courthouse smelled like old paper and industrial cleaning solution, the same institutional aroma I'd encountered in government buildings for 50 years. I arrived when the doors opened at 8, carrying a manila folder with the beach wedding photos and a determination that had crystallized overnight into something harder than anger. The clerk at the marriage records office was a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and the patient manner of someone who'd spent years helping people navigate bureaucracy. She looked up from her computer when I approached the counter. "Good morning. How can I help you?" "I need to check marriage records for my son, Michael Thompson. The ceremony would have been sometime in the past 2 weeks." She nodded and turned to her keyboard. "And the bride's name?" "Sarah Elizabeth Collins." Her fingers clicked across the keys with practiced efficiency. After a moment, she looked up with a slight frown. "I'm not showing any record of that marriage in this county, sir. Are you sure about the timing?" "Very sure. Try October 10th specifically." More typing, then she shook her head. Nothing on that date either. Is it possible they were married in a different county? I thought about the beach photos, the palm trees and white sand. Is there a way to check other states? It might have been a destination wedding. That's more complicated. Each state maintains its own records, and some have different processing times. If you have a specific location in mind, I could suggest who to contact. I thanked her and walked back to my truck, sitting in the parking lot while I processed this new information. Either Frank had been wrong about the wedding date, or Michael and Sarah had been married somewhere that didn't require immediate record keeping. Or the beach photos were from something else entirely, but the photos had looked too real, too spontaneous to be fake, which meant I was still missing pieces of this puzzle. I drove home slowly, taking the long way past the elementary school where Michael had played Little League, the park where we'd flown kites on Sunday afternoons when Margaret was alive. Memory lane felt particularly bitter this morning, filled with reminders of the boy my son used to be before he'd learned to lie with such casual precision. Back in my garage, I spread the photos across my workbench under the bright fluorescent light, studying them like evidence at a crime scene. There had to be clues here, details that would tell me when and where these pictures had been taken. I found what I was looking for in the background of the third photo, a sign, partially obscured but readable, Paradise Cove Resort, Key Largo, and in the corner of another picture, a timestamp that was barely visible but definitely there. October 10th, 2023. Frank had been right about the date, but Key Largo was in Florida, which explained why there were no marriage records in our county. They'd had some kind of ceremony at a resort, but whether it was legally binding remained to be seen. I was still examining the photos when my phone rang. Michael again, his third call in 2 days after months of barely speaking to me. Dad, I wanted to touch base about the wedding. Make sure you have everything you need. I set down the magnifying glass I'd been using to study the photos. Actually, I've been meaning to ask you something. I was talking to Mrs. Collins yesterday. A sharp intake of breath. Oh, what did you two discuss? She mentioned that you and Sarah have already planned all the traditional father activities. I was wondering what those might be, since I wasn't aware we'd discussed any activities at all. Silence stretched across the line. When Michael finally spoke, his voice had lost its practiced warmth. Dad, I think there might be some confusion here. Mrs. Collins can be a little presumptuous sometimes. She doesn't always speak for Sarah and me. I see. So you haven't planned all the traditional activities? Not exactly. I mean, we're still working out the details. The whole thing is still coming together. I picked up the photo showing Michael barefoot on the beach, flowers in Sarah's hair, both of them wearing wedding rings that caught the tropical sunlight. Michael, where did you and Sarah go for your vacation last week? Another pause, longer this time. Vacation? Sarah mentioned on Facebook that you two had taken a trip somewhere warm. I was just curious where you went. The lie came so easily I almost missed it. Oh, that. We went to Miami, just a long weekend. Sarah needed a break from wedding planning. Miami's nice this time of year. Did you stay on the beach? Yeah, we stayed at a hotel near the water. Nothing fancy. I set the photo down and leaned back in my metal folding chair. My son was lying about a trip to Florida, lying about activities that had apparently been planned without my knowledge, and lying about a wedding that either had already happened or was being staged for reasons I didn't yet understand. Well, I hope you had a good time, I said. Sometimes a break from planning is exactly what people need. After he hung up, I sat in the garage for a long time, surrounded by the familiar smells of motor oil and old leather, trying to decide what to do with the growing certainty that my son was planning something that would hurt me deeply. The fake invitation, the vague venue, the careful phone calls, it all pointed towards some kind of elaborate setup. But why? What could I have done to deserve this level of deception? The answer came to me while I was cleaning carburetor parts in a pan of solvent, my hands working automatically while my mind wandered through possibilities. 3 months ago, I'd refused to co-sign a loan for Michael and Sarah. They'd wanted to buy a house in an expensive neighborhood, something well beyond what his insurance company's salary could reasonably support. When they'd asked me to guarantee the mortgage, I'd said no. Dad, it's just a formality, Michael had argued, standing in this same garage while I worked on the Mustang's transmission. We can afford the payments. The bank just wants additional security. If you can afford the payments, you don't need me to co-sign. That's not how it works. You know that. I'd looked up from the transmission, meeting his eyes. Son, I've seen what happens when people buy houses they can't afford. I've processed the insurance claims when those houses get foreclosed on. I won't put my name on something like that. He'd left angry, and Sarah had called later that evening with a cooler, more calculated approach. She'd explained about interest rates and investment opportunities, about how property values were increasing, about how this was really a favor to me, because I'd be helping them build wealth that would eventually benefit everyone in the family. I'd said no to her too. That had been the last real conversation we'd had until the fake invitation arrived. 3 months of minimal contact, stilted phone calls, the gradual understanding that my refusal had created a rift that wouldn't heal easily. Now, apparently, it was payback time. I finished cleaning the carburetor parts and laid them out on a clean towel to dry, my hands working from muscle memory, while my mind processed what I'd learned. My son and his wife had gotten married in Florida without inviting me, then sent me a fake invitation to a non-existent wedding so they could, what? Humiliate me publicly? Make me look like a fool in front of Sarah's family and friends? The plan was taking shape in my mind, ugly in its simplicity. I'd show up at the fake venue on November 18th, dressed in my best suit, carrying a gift, expecting to walk my son down the aisle or give a father's toast. Instead, I'd find nothing. Or worse, I'd find a group of people who were all in on the joke, waiting to see how long it would take me to understand that I'd been set up. The thought of it made my hands shake with something that wasn't quite rage, but was close enough. The boy I'd taught to ride a bicycle, the teenager I'd driven to job interviews, the young man I'd helped move into his first apartment, that person was gone. In his place was someone capable of orchestrating my public humiliation as punishment for refusing to guarantee a mortgage. I walked back into the house and made myself a sandwich I didn't want, eating it while standing at the kitchen window and staring out at Margaret's rose garden. She would have been horrified by this situation, appalled at the idea that our son could be so deliberately cruel. Margaret had always believed in the essential goodness of people, had always assumed that misunderstandings could be resolved with honest conversation and good intentions. But Margaret had never had to deal with a son who could lie as smoothly as Michael had been lying. She'd never had to navigate the particular cruelty of family members who viewed kindness as weakness and trust as something to be exploited. I was still standing at the window when I saw Frank Morrison walking across my backyard, moving with the purposeful stride of a man who had something important to say. I met him at the back door. "Richard, we need to talk." "Come in. Coffee?" "This isn't a coffee conversation." He remained standing in my kitchen, his expression grim. "I did some more digging online last night, found some things you need to see." He pulled out his phone and swiped to a series of screenshots, social media posts, mostly from Sarah's friends and family members, comments about the amazing wedding and beautiful ceremony and so glad we could be there, all dated October 11th and 12th, the days after the beach wedding. "There's more," Frank said, swiping to another screen. "Look at this. A Facebook event page created by Sarah's mother, celebrating Michael and Sarah Thompson with a date of November 18th and a location listed as Private Residence Springfield. Below that, a description that made my blood run cold. Join us for an evening celebrating the newlyweds and saying goodbye to old family traditions. Light refreshments and entertainment provided. Saying goodbye to old family traditions, I read aloud. That's not the worst part. Frank swiped again. Look at the guest list. 57 people had been invited to this event. Sarah's extended family, co-workers, college friends, people I'd never met and never would meet. My name wasn't on the list, but there was a note at the bottom that stopped my heart. Special surprise guest appearance planned. Don't spoil it by mentioning to certain family members. I sat down hard in one of my kitchen chairs, the full scope of their plan finally becoming clear. They weren't just planning to humiliate me. They were planning to turn it into entertainment for a crowd. I'd show up at the fake venue, confused and dressed for a wedding that had already happened, and somehow that confusion would become the evening's main event. Jesus, Richard. I'm sorry you had to see this, but I figured you needed to know what you're walking into. I nodded, not trusting my voice. The sandwich I'd eaten felt like concrete in my stomach, and the familiar kitchen suddenly felt like foreign territory. Everything I'd thought I knew about my son, everything I'd believed about our relationship, had been built on assumptions that were proving devastatingly wrong. "Frank," I said finally, "what would you do if you were in my position?" He considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Well, I sure as hell wouldn't show up to be their entertainment, but I also wouldn't let them get away with it." "Meaning what?" "Meaning you've got 3 weeks to figure out how to turn this around. Make them regret they ever thought Richard Thompson was someone they could mess with." After Frank left, I sat alone in my kitchen as the afternoon shadows grew longer, staring at the fake invitation that had started all of this. The cream-colored cardstock suddenly looked different. Not elegant, but sinister. A trap disguised as an honor. But Richard Thompson hadn't survived 72 years by walking into traps blindly. If my son wanted to play games with his old man, he was about to discover that some games had consequences he hadn't considered. I pulled out a legal pad and began making notes, the same way I'd approached complex insurance investigations for 30 years. First, establish what you know for certain. Second, identify what you need to find out. Third, develop a strategy that protects your interests while achieving your objectives. What I knew, Michael and Sarah were already married. The November 18th event was designed to humiliate me. 57 people were expecting to be entertained by my confusion and embarrassment. What I needed to find out, the exact nature of their plan, the location where this celebration would actually take place, whether there were legal implications to any of this. What I intended to do about it, that remained to be seen. But whatever it was, it wouldn't involve showing up like a confused old man to be laughed at by people I'd never met. The kitchen clock ticked steadily above the sink, marking time until November 18th. 3 weeks to plan a response that would remind my son exactly who he was dealing with. 3 weeks to show him that Richard Thompson was nobody's fool and nobody's entertainment. The war my son had started was about to become very real. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in the bed Margaret and I had shared for 40 years, staring at the ceiling and listening to the house settle around me, while my mind worked through possibilities like a computer processing data. By 3 a.m, I'd reached a conclusion that surprised me with its clarity. I wasn't angry anymore. I was done being angry. What I felt now was something colder and more purposeful. The kind of focused determination I'd used to solve complex insurance cases, the methodical approach that had built a successful career out of patience and careful observation. Michael had made a fundamental error in judgment. He'd assumed his old man would react emotionally, would stumble blindly into their trap like a confused old fool. He was about to learn how wrong that assumption was. At dawn, I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table with the legal pad I'd started the night before, adding details and refining my understanding of the situation. The fake invitation wasn't just cruel. It was evidence of premeditation. The Facebook event page showed coordination between multiple parties. This wasn't a spontaneous act of spite. It was a carefully planned operation designed to humiliate me in front of an audience. But operations could be disrupted. Plans could be turned against the people who made them. And Richard Thompson had spent 30 years learning how to do exactly that. My first call was to Harold Brennan, the lawyer who'd handled Margaret's will and had been our family attorney for 20 years. Harold was my age, semi-retired, but still sharp as a tack, and more importantly, he understood the value of discretion. "Richard," he said when his secretary put me through, "good to hear from you. How are you managing?" "I'm managing fine, Harold. I need some legal advice, and I need it to stay between us." "Of course. What's the situation?" I explained everything. The fake invitation, the real wedding in Florida, the planned humiliation event. Harold listened without interrupting, the way good lawyers do when they're gathering facts. "Well," he said finally, "this is certainly unusual. From a legal standpoint, sending you false information about a wedding isn't technically fraud, since no money changed hands. But there might be other implications here, especially if this is part of a pattern of elder abuse or financial manipulation." "I don't think it's about money. I think it's about punishment." "For what?" "I refused to co-sign a mortgage for them 3 months ago. Apparently, that made me the enemy." Harold was quiet for a moment. "Richard, I have to ask, are you certain you want to pursue this legally? Family disputes can get very ugly very quickly, and once you involve attorneys, there's often no going back to normal relationships." I looked out the kitchen window at Margaret's rose garden, dormant now, but still arranged in the careful pattern she'd spent years perfecting. Harold, there's no relationship left to go back to. My son set up an elaborate scheme to humiliate me in front of strangers. That ship has sailed. All right then, what do you want me to do? For now, just research. I want to know what legal options I have, what protections I might need, and whether there's any way to hold them accountable for this kind of behavior. I'm not ready to file anything yet, but I want to know what weapons are in my arsenal. I can do that. And Richard, document everything. Every phone call, every text message, every piece of evidence you have about this scheme. If we do end up pursuing this legally, we'll want a comprehensive record. After I hung up with Harold, I sat in my reading chair and began organizing the evidence I'd collected. The fake invitation, the beach wedding photos, screenshots of the Facebook event page Frank had shown me, notes from every phone conversation with Michael and Sarah's mother. It was already a substantial file, and I suspected it would grow larger before this was over. The phone rang just after 10. Michael again, his daily check-in calls becoming as predictable as sunrise. "Dad, how are you doing today?" "I'm fine, son. Just organizing some paperwork. Anything I can help with?" I looked down at the evidence spread across my coffee table. "Actually, yes. I've been trying to figure out travel arrangements for the wedding, and I realized I never got that address for Riverside Gardens. Could you text that to me?" A pause. "Oh, right. I keep forgetting to ask Sarah for those details. She's been handling all the vendor communications." "No problem. I can call her directly if that's easier." "No!" The word came out sharp, then he modulated his tone. "I mean, she's been really stressed about the planning. I'd rather handle it myself." "Of course. You know, it might help if I knew what time I should arrive. Just the ceremony at 4, or should I come earlier for photos or family time?" Another pause, longer this time. We're still working out those details. The timeline is pretty fluid right now." "Fluid timeline for a wedding that's less than 3 weeks away?" "Sarah's parents have very specific ideas about how they want things to flow. We're trying to accommodate everyone's needs." I almost laughed at the audacity of it. He was still maintaining the fiction, still playing his role in their elaborate deception, even though he had to know I was getting suspicious. "Well," I said, "I'm sure it will all work out beautifully." "Thanks, Dad. I really appreciate your patience with all this." After he hung up, I sat with the phone in my hand, marveling at his performance. The concern in his voice, the apologetic tone, the careful references to other people's demands, it was masterfully done. If I hadn't seen the evidence, I might have believed every word, but I had seen the evidence, and now I needed to figure out exactly what they were planning for November 18th. That afternoon, I drove to Springfield and spent 3 hours methodically checking every wedding venue, event hall, and hotel in the city. I had photos of Michael and Sarah on my phone, and I showed them to managers and booking coordinators everywhere I went. No one recognized them. No one had any record of a Thompson Collins wedding or celebration. On my way home, I stopped at the public library and spent another hour using their computers to search for any mention of Riverside Gardens in connection with weddings, events, or even landscaping. Nothing. The venue simply didn't exist, which meant the real event was happening somewhere else entirely. I was driving past the Springfield Country Club when inspiration struck. I pulled into their parking lot and walked inside, where a young woman at the reception desk greeted me with professional enthusiasm. "Good afternoon. How can I help you?" "I'm trying to track down information about an event on November 18th, a celebration for the Thompson Collins families. I believe it might be held here." She turned to her computer and typed for a moment. "I'm not showing anything under those names for that date. Could it be under a different name?" "Try Collins, Janet, and Robert Collins." More typing, then a nod. "Yes, here it is. Private residence event, November 18th, 7 to 11 p.m. But this isn't scheduled to be held here. They've rented our catering equipment and staff for an off-site location." My heart rate picked up. "Off-site location? Let me see." She clicked through several screens. "It shows the address is 428 Elmwood Drive. That's the Collins family residence." I thanked her and walked back to my truck on unsteady legs. They weren't planning to hold their fake celebration at a non-existent venue. They were holding it at Sarah's parents' house, which meant when I showed up at the fictional Riverside Gardens on November 18th, I wouldn't find anything at all. I'd be standing alone in an empty parking lot somewhere, holding a gift for a wedding that had already happened, while 57 people at the Collins house waited to hear about my confusion. The picture was finally complete. I'd arrive at the fake venue, realize I'd been deceived, and either give up and go home in humiliation or desperately try to track down the real location. Either way, my confusion and desperation would become the evening's entertainment when someone inevitably shared the story with the party guests. It was crueler than I'd imagined and more carefully planned, but it was also more vulnerable to disruption than they realized. I spent the evening in my garage, working on the Mustang's carburetor, while my mind processed strategy. The car had been Margaret's idea originally. She'd seen it at an estate sale and insisted I buy it, even though it hadn't run in 15 years. "You need a project," she'd said, running her hand along the dusty fender. "Something to keep your hands busy when you retire." She'd been right, as usual. The slow work of restoration had filled countless hours since her death, giving me something concrete to focus on when the house felt too empty and the silence too heavy. Tonight, the familiar rhythm of disassembly and cleaning helped me think through the logistics of what I was planning. By 10 o'clock, I'd made my decision. I wasn't going to show up at the fake venue on November 18th like a confused old man. I wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of seeing me humiliated. But I also wasn't going to simply ignore their elaborate scheme. Instead, I was going to turn their plan against them in a way they'd never see coming. I walked back into the house and opened the folder Harold had asked me to create, adding today's discoveries to the growing pile of evidence: the catering rental information, the real address where their celebration would take place, the phone conversation where Michael had lied about the vendor communications. Then I pulled out a fresh sheet of legal pad paper and began making a different kind of list. Not evidence this time, but resources, people I could call on, favors I could collect, tools I could use to ensure that November 18th became a day Michael and Sarah would remember for all the wrong reasons. Margaret's photograph smiled at me from the mantel, and for the first time in 2 years, I felt like she was truly with me in spirit. She'd always been fiercely protective of family, but she'd also had no tolerance for people who tried to take advantage of others. She would have been appalled by Michael's behavior, but she would have been proud of what I was planning to do about it. "Don't worry, Maggie," I said quietly to her image. "Our boy is about to learn that some lessons can only be taught the hard way." The house settled around me with its familiar creaks and sighs, but tonight they sounded different. Not lonely, but purposeful. Like the house itself was preparing for what was coming. I had 13 days to execute a plan that would turn Michael's carefully orchestrated humiliation into something he'd never forget. 13 days to show my son that Richard Thompson was nobody's fool and that some betrayals came with consequences he'd never considered. The war was about to begin in earnest, and this time I intended to win. The next morning, I called in the first favor I'd collected in 40 years of careful relationship building. Danny Walsh had been a young police officer when I had helped him navigate an insurance claim after his patrol car was totaled by a drunk driver in 1987. Now, he was chief of police in Springfield, 2 years from retirement, and still grateful enough to take my call personally. "Richard Thompson," he said when his secretary put me through. "Been too long? How are you holding up since Margaret passed?" "Getting by, Danny. Listen, I need a professional consultation, and I'm willing to pay your usual rate for private security work." "This sounds serious. What's the situation?" I explained the fake wedding invitation, the beach ceremony I'd been excluded from, and the planned humiliation event at the Collins house. Danny listened with the patient attention of a man who had heard every possible variation of human stupidity over 30 years in law enforcement. "So, let me get this straight," he said when I finished. "Your son and daughter-in-law got married in Florida, then sent you a fake invitation to a wedding that doesn't exist, so you'll show up confused and they can laugh about it with their friends? That's the situation. Jesus, Richard, that's not just cruel, it's elaborate, the kind of thing that takes real planning and coordination. Which is why I need professional help. I want to know exactly what they're planning for November 18th, who's going to be there, what the timeline looks like, whether they're recording anything for social media. I want complete intelligence on their operation." Danny was quiet for a moment. "You know, in most circumstances, I'd tell you to just cut your losses and walk away from people who'd treat you like this. But this feels different. This feels like they're treating you like a victim, not just a family member they disagree with. That's exactly what it is. All right, I can't use department resources for this, but I know some people who do private investigation work. Discreet, professional, and very good at gathering information without being noticed. You want me to make some calls? I want you to make whatever calls are necessary to get me everything I need to know about what's happening at 4028 Elmwood Drive on November 18th. Consider it done. But Richard, whatever you're planning to do with this information, make sure it stays on the right side of the law. I'd hate to see you get in trouble over people who clearly aren't worth it. Don't worry about me, Danny. I've been navigating legal gray areas longer than most lawyers. After we hung up, I made my second call. Tom Morrison was Frank's older brother, a private investigator who specialized in insurance fraud and had worked with my company on dozens of cases over the years. Tom was discreet, thorough, and had a particular talent for digital surveillance that bordered on the artistic. "Richard," he said when he answered, "Frank told me you might be calling. He filled me in on some of the background. This is a hell of a thing your son's doing." "It is. I need to know everything about what's planned for November 18th. And I need it documented in a way that would hold up in court if necessary." "Court? You thinking about pursuing this legally?" "I'm thinking about keeping my options open. Right now, I just want information. Complete, comprehensive, undeniable information about exactly what they think they're going to do to me." "I can do that. Give me a week and I'll have everything you need. Photos, audio recordings, social media posts, guest lists, catering details, the whole package. What's your usual rate for this kind of work?" "For you? Nothing. Frank told me about your Margaret's funeral, how you handled all the arrangements when their mother was too sick to travel. Some favors don't have expiration dates." The third call was more personal. Reverend Patricia Hayes had been Margaret's pastor at the Methodist Church, and had become something of a friend to both of us over the years. She was in her 60s with the kind of practical wisdom that comes from listening to people's problems for 30 years. And more importantly, she understood the difference between forgiveness and enabling. "Richard," she said warmly when I called, "how lovely to hear from you. Are you doing well?" "I'm managing, Patricia. Actually, I'm calling because I could use some spiritual guidance on a family matter." "Of course. Would you like to come in and talk?" "I think that would be best. This isn't something I want to discuss over the phone." We arranged to meet that afternoon at the church. I spent the morning organizing my evidence file, making sure I could present the situation clearly and completely. Patricia had known Michael since he was a child, had watched him grow up in the youth programs, had even counseled him and Sarah before their engagement. If anyone would understand the full scope of how far he'd fallen from the person he used to be, it would be her. The church was quiet when I arrived, filled with the kind of peaceful silence that old buildings seem to cultivate over decades of prayer and contemplation. Patricia met me in her office, a comfortable space lined with theological books and photographs of his church families from years past. "You look troubled, Richard. Tell me what's weighing on your heart." I spread out the evidence on her coffee table, the fake invitation, the beach wedding photos, the screenshots of the Facebook event page. Patricia examined each piece carefully, her expression growing more serious as she began to understand what she was looking at. "This is extraordinarily cruel," she said finally. "And it's not the Michael I remember from confirmation class. That boy had a good heart, even if he sometimes made poor decisions." That's what I keep telling myself. But Patricia, I'm having trouble seeing any of the good heart in what he's doing now. She sat back in her chair, studying me with the kind of penetrating gaze that made you feel like she could see straight through to your soul. "What are you planning to do about this?" "I'm not sure yet, but I know I'm not going to just accept it and move on. This isn't the kind of behavior that should go without consequences. Consequences can take many forms, Richard. The question is whether you want consequences that teach or consequences that simply punish. I considered that distinction. I want consequences that make sure this never happens again, to me or to anyone else. Then you need to think very carefully about what those consequences should be, because once you take action, you can't undo it, and whatever you do will define not just how Michael sees you, but how you see yourself." We talked for another hour, exploring the theological and practical implications of different responses. Patricia didn't try to tell me what to do, but she helped me think through the moral dimensions of what I was considering. By the time I left, I had a clearer sense of the principles that would guide my actions. That evening, Tom Morrison called with his first report. "Richard, I've been doing some preliminary research on your son's social media accounts and his wife's family. What I'm finding is pretty ugly. Tell me." There are private group chats where they've been discussing this plan for weeks. Screenshots, detailed logistics, even jokes about how confused you're going to be when you show up at the wrong place. And Richard, they're not just planning to laugh about it privately. They're planning to live stream your reaction when you realize what's happened. The phone felt heavy in my hand. Live stream it? Sarah's cousin is some kind of social media influencer, has about 50,000 followers. The plan is for her to film your confusion and post it online as comedy content. They've already created hashtags and everything. I sat down hard in my kitchen chair, the full scope of their cruelty finally becoming clear. This wasn't just about humiliating me in front of 57 people at a private party. They were planning to turn my pain into content for thousands of strangers on the internet. Tom, I want you to document all of this. Every message, every plan, every detail about what they think they're going to do. I want evidence that would convince a judge that this was premeditated harassment designed to cause emotional distress. You got it. And Richard, I'm sorry your boy turned out like this. No father deserves what they're putting you through. After Tom hung up, I sat in my darkened kitchen for a long time, watching the shadows lengthen across the floor. Margaret's photograph was barely visible in the dim light from the street lamp outside, but I could feel her presence like a physical weight in the room. "They want to turn me into a laughingstock, Maggie," I said quietly. "Our son wants to humiliate his father in front of the entire internet." The house was silent around me, but I knew what Margaret would say if she could speak. She'd remind me that I'd faced worse things than this and survived. That I'd built a life and a reputation that couldn't be destroyed by the cruel games of people who didn't understand real strength or real character. And she'd remind me that Richard Thompson had never been anyone's victim, and he was too old to start now. I walked to my desk and pulled out a fresh legal pad, beginning to sketch out the framework of a plan that would turn Michael's carefully orchestrated cruelty into the biggest mistake of his life. They wanted to make me into content for their entertainment. They were about to discover that some content creators became the content themselves. But first, I needed to make one more call. Harold Brennan answered on the second ring, despite the late hour. "Richard, everything all right?" "Harold, I need you to start preparing documents. I'm going to need a new will, updated financial arrangements, and some specific legal protections that will take effect immediately. This is about the wedding situation. This is about making sure my son understands that there are consequences for treating family like enemies, real consequences that will last longer than his moment of entertainment." "What kind of consequences are we talking about?" I looked around the kitchen where Margaret and I had shared 40 years of morning coffee, where we'd planned our retirement and dreamed about grandchildren who would never exist, where I now sat alone, targeted for humiliation by the boy I'd raised and loved, and tried to prepare for a world that was apparently crueler than I'd understood. "The kind that will make him wish he'd never heard the name Richard Thompson," I said quietly, "and the kind that will make sure no one else ever has to go through what he's putting me through. I'll start drafting paperwork first thing in the morning." "Thank you, Harold. And Harold, make sure everything is ironclad. I don't want any room for appeals or second chances. When this is over, it's going to be over permanently." The war Michael had started was about to escalate beyond anything he could imagine. And by the time November 18th arrived, he was going to learn that some victories come with a price tag he couldn't afford to pay. 10 days before November 18th, Tom Morrison arrived at my house with a manila folder thick enough to choke a horse, and the grim expression of a man who'd seen too much human ugliness in 1 week. We sat at my kitchen table while he spread out photographs, printed text messages, and social media screenshots like evidence at a murder trial. "Richard, this is worse than I thought," he said, pulling out a stack of printed messages. "They've been planning this for 2 months, not 2 weeks. It started right after you refused to co-sign their mortgage." I picked up the first page, a group chat between Michael, Sarah, and her parents. The timestamp showed September 15th, 3 days after I'd said no to the loan. "Michael, Dad was a real asshole about the house thing. Maybe it's time he learned some consequences." Janet Collins. "What did you have in mind?" Michael. "Something that shows him what happens when you don't support family. Something public. Robert Collins. We could use the wedding as cover, make him think he's invited then. Sarah. OMG, yes. Like a fake invitation to nowhere. He'd show up all dressed up with nowhere to go. Janet Collins. That's brilliant. And we could document the whole thing for evidence of his mental decline. Very useful for future decisions about his care. The words hit me like physical blows. Evidence of mental decline. Future decisions about his care. This wasn't just about revenge for the mortgage. This was about establishing a narrative that would justify taking control of my life. Keep reading, Tom said quietly. It gets worse. The next set of messages detailed their research into elder abuse laws, what constituted evidence of incompetence, how to document confusion and disorientation in elderly relatives. They'd consulted with a lawyer about guardianship procedures. They'd researched assisted living facilities in the area. Sarah, the key is establishing a pattern of poor judgment and confusion. The fake wedding response will be perfect evidence. Janet Collins, and if we get it on video, showing him lost and disoriented, that's even better for court proceedings. Michael, I feel bad about this, but he's getting older. Maybe it's better if we take control now, before he makes bigger mistakes. Robert Collins, it's not cruel if it's for his own good. And frankly, he can't take that house and property with him. I set the pages down with shaking hands. They weren't just planning to humiliate me. They were planning to use that humiliation as evidence to have me declared incompetent and seize control of my assets. The fake wedding was the first step in a larger plan to steal my independence, my property, and my life. There's more, Tom said, pulling out another stack. They've already contacted the county about elder welfare checks, filed preliminary reports expressing concern about your mental state and ability to live independently. They what? Apparently, your son has been telling people that you've been showing signs of dementia, forgetting conversations, making poor financial decisions, exhibiting paranoid behavior. He's been building a case against you for weeks. The room felt smaller suddenly, the walls pressing closer. I thought about the careful phone conversations, Michael's patient tone when I asked questions about the wedding details. He'd been documenting my confusion and paranoia every time I expressed doubt about their vague answers. Tom, please tell me you have evidence that this is all fabricated. I have everything, every message, every lie, every piece of manufactured evidence they've created. But Richard, you need to understand. They're not amateurs at this. Robert Collins is a retired attorney. He knows exactly what kind of evidence would hold up in a competency hearing. And what kind of evidence would that be? Documented instances of confusion, poor judgment, inability to manage basic life functions? The kind of things that would be perfectly demonstrated by an elderly man showing up at the wrong location for a wedding, confused and disoriented, unable to understand what had gone wrong. I walked to the window and stared out at Margaret's rose garden, trying to process the full scope of what they'd planned. It wasn't enough to hurt me. They wanted to destroy me, take my house, my independence, my dignity, everything I'd built in 72 years of living. There's one more thing, Tom said behind me. The live stream plan, it's not just for entertainment. They plan to use that video as evidence in guardianship proceedings. Show a judge how confused and disoriented you are, how you can't manage basic social situations. I turned back to face him. How long do I have before they file for guardianship? Based on what I'm seeing in their messages, they're planning to move right after the fake wedding event. Use the video evidence and the police welfare check reports to petition the court for emergency guardianship. Could be as soon as November 20th. 2 days after their planned humiliation, they'd turn me into internet content on Saturday night, then use that content to steal my life on Monday morning. But they'd made one crucial mistake. They'd underestimated exactly who they were dealing with. I walked to my desk and pulled out the folder Harold had prepared for me the previous week. Legal documents that would protect my assets, my independence, and my ability to make my own decisions. Documents that also included some surprises Michael wasn't expecting. Tom, I need you to expand your investigation. I want to know everything about their financial situation, their marriage, their business dealings. If they're planning to destroy me, I want ammunition to destroy them right back. Richard, are you sure about this? Once you start down this road, there's no coming back. Family relationships don't survive this kind of warfare. I thought about the text messages on my kitchen table, about my son plotting to have me declared incompetent so he could steal my house, about the elaborate cruelty of using my love for him as a weapon against me. Tom, the family relationship is already dead. They killed it when they decided to treat me like a mark instead of a father. Now, I'm just deciding whether to bury it quietly or make sure everyone knows what kind of people they really are. He nodded and began packing up his evidence. I'll have a complete financial workup on all of them within a week. And Richard, for what it's worth, I think you're making the right choice. Some people only understand consequences. After Tom left, I called Harold. Harold, how soon can you have those documents ready for filing? I can have everything prepared by tomorrow afternoon. But, Richard, once you execute these papers, there's no undoing what you're about to do. Are you certain this is what you want? I looked at the text messages still spread across my kitchen table, at the calculated cruelty of people who were supposed to love me. Harold, I've never been more certain of anything in my life. Then I'll have everything ready. And Richard, they're going to be very, very sorry they decided to mess with you. That evening, I sat in Margaret's chair with a cup of coffee and began planning the final phase of my response. November 18th was 8 days away. 8 days to execute a plan that would turn their elaborate trap into the biggest mistake of their lives. They wanted to document my confusion and disorientation. I'd give them confusion and disorientation they'd never forget. They wanted to use my reaction as evidence of incompetence. They were about to discover what real incompetence looked like when their own lives started falling apart. They wanted to destroy Richard Thompson. They were about to learn that Richard Thompson didn't destroy easily. And when he did fight back, he fought to win. I pulled out a fresh legal pad and began writing. Not evidence this time, but a strategy. A detailed, methodical plan for November 18th that would ensure my son's elaborate cruelty became the instrument of his own destruction. Margaret's photograph seemed to smile at me from the mantel, and I could almost hear her voice whispering the words she'd said to me 40 years ago when we'd bought our first house together. Richard Thompson, you're the strongest man I know, and you never back down from a fight when you know you're right. She'd been right then, and she was right now. The boy I'd raised had declared war on his father, but he'd forgotten that wars are won by the side with better planning, superior resources, and the willingness to do whatever it takes to achieve victory. Michael was about to get a masterclass in all three. The kitchen clock ticked steadily toward midnight, marking time until November 18th. 8 days to prepare. 8 days to position every piece exactly where it needed to be. 8 days to ensure that when the trap snapped shut, it would catch the right people. I had work to do. Part 7. November 18th dawned gray and cold, with the kind of sharp wind that cuts through jacket fabric and finds every gap in your defenses. I stood at my kitchen window, watching the last autumn leaves spiral down from the oak tree Margaret had planted the year Michael was born, and felt something settle in my chest that wasn't quite peace, but was close enough. Today was the day my son expected to destroy me. Instead, it would be the day I taught him that some lessons can only be learned the hard way. I dressed carefully, the same navy suit I'd worn to Margaret's funeral, the tie she'd bought me for our 40th anniversary. If this was going to be a performance, I intended to look the part. But unlike the confused, disoriented old man Michael expected to show up at his fake venue, I knew exactly where I was going and what I was going to do when I got there. At exactly 3:30 p.m., I climbed into my truck and began the drive to Springfield. Not to the non-existent Riverside Gardens, where Michael expected me to wander around confused and lost, but to Howell's 128 Elmwood Drive, where 57 people were gathering to laugh at my humiliation. They had no idea I was coming. The Collins house was everything I'd expected from Sarah's parents, an oversized colonial on a manicured lot, the kind of place that screamed money without quite achieving elegance. The circular driveway was already crowded with expensive cars, and I could see catering staff moving efficiently between a white tent in the backyard and the house's rear entrance. I parked across the street and sat for a moment, watching the final preparations for my planned destruction. Tom Morrison had been thorough in his intelligence gathering. I knew that the live stream was scheduled to begin at 4:15, just 15 minutes after I was supposed to arrive at the fake venue. I knew that Sarah's influencer cousin had positioned cameras throughout the house to capture every angle of their entertainment. I knew that Robert Collins had prepared a speech about family disappointments that was designed to justify their treatment of me. What they didn't know was that I'd spent the past week preparing a few surprises of my own. I pulled out my phone and sent a single text message to a number I'd memorized but never called. Execute now. Within 30 seconds, I received 3 confirmations that the first phase of my plan was in motion. At exactly 4 p.m., I walked up the Collins front steps and rang the doorbell. Janet Collins opened the door with a bright hostess smile that faltered the moment she saw me. "Richard, you're not supposed to be here. Hello, Janet. I hope I'm not too late for the celebration." Behind her, I could see people turning in my direction, confusion rippling through the elegantly dressed crowd. Michael appeared at his mother-in-law's shoulder, his face cycling through surprise, alarm, and something that might have been panic. "Dad, how did you... we weren't expecting me at my son's wedding celebration? How odd." I stepped past Janet into the foyer, noting the professionally arranged flowers, the hired bartenders, the elaborate spread that had obviously cost serious money. "This is quite a party, much more elaborate than I expected for a simple family gathering." Sarah appeared beside Michael, her face pale but her smile intact. "Mr. Thompson, there's been some confusion. This isn't actually what, Sarah? A celebration of your marriage? Because that's what the invitation said." I pulled the cream-colored card from my jacket pocket and held it up for everyone to see. "November 18th, it says right here. Though I have to admit, I was surprised when I couldn't find Riverside Gardens." The room had gone completely quiet now, 57 people watching this unexpected drama unfold. I could see Sarah's cousin discreetly adjusting her phone, probably trying to get the perfect angle for their planned live stream. "Actually," I continued, "I was so surprised that I did some research. Very interesting what you can discover when you really start looking into things." Michael's jaw was clenched so tight I thought he might crack a tooth. "Dad, maybe we should talk privately." "Oh, I don't think that's necessary. After all, you've planned this as a public event." I turned to address the crowd, noting how many phones were now pointed in my direction. "Ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you all for coming to celebrate my son's marriage, which, as I'm sure you all know, actually took place on October 10th at the Paradise Cove Resort in Key Largo." Murmurs of confusion rippled through the room. Several people looked at Michael and Sarah with surprise. Apparently, not everyone had been in on the deception. "That's right," I continued. "Michael and Sarah have been married for over a month. This lovely party tonight was actually planned as entertainment at my expense. You see, they sent me an invitation to a wedding at a venue that doesn't exist, expecting me to show up confused and disoriented so you could all have a good laugh." The murmurs grew louder. Janet Collins pushed forward, her face flushed. "Richard, you don't understand the situation." "Oh, but I do understand. Perfectly." I pulled out a manila folder from my jacket, the same one Tom Morrison had prepared for me. "I understand that you've been documenting what you call my mental decline for use in guardianship proceedings. I understand that you plan to live stream my confusion tonight as evidence of incompetence. And I understand that you've already filed preliminary paperwork to have me declared unfit to manage my own affairs." The room had gone deadly silent now. Michael looked like he'd been turned to stone. "But here's what you didn't understand," I continued, opening the folder. "Richard Thompson didn't survive 72 years by being anyone's fool. And when people try to make him into one, he fights back." I pulled out the first document Harold had prepared and held it up. "This is a restraining order, filed this morning, preventing any member of the Collins or Thompson families from initiating guardianship proceedings against me. It's based on evidence of harassment, fraud, and attempted financial exploitation." Sarah's face had gone completely white. Her father pushed through the crowd, his lawyer's instincts finally kicking in. "Richard, you need to stop this right now. You're making serious accusations without evidence." I pulled out Tom's surveillance report, thick with printed messages and photographs. "I have every text message you sent planning this elaborate deception. Every conversation where you discussed using my confusion as evidence of incompetence. Every lie you told about my mental state to justify your actions. I turned back to the crowd, noting how the phones that had been prepared to record my humiliation were now capturing something very different. "But that's not the most interesting part," I said. "The most interesting part is what I discovered about my son and daughter-in-law's financial situation while I was investigating their little scheme." Michael finally found his voice. "Dad, stop, please. Stop? But son, you wanted a public celebration. You wanted entertainment. You wanted everyone here to witness something memorable." I pulled out another document. "How about we start with the fact that your real wedding in Florida was paid for with money from a business loan you obtained under false pretenses?" A collective intake of breath from the crowd. Sarah's cousin had lowered her phone, realizing that whatever was happening wasn't going according to plan. "Or we could discuss the mortgage fraud you attempted on the house you're currently living in. Did you know they listed me as a co-signer without my knowledge or consent? Very illegal, very serious consequences." Robert Collins stepped forward, his face red with rage. "That's enough. I want you out of my house right now." "Your house?" I smiled for the first time since arriving. "That's interesting, Robert, because according to the foreclosure notice that was filed this morning, it won't be your house much longer." The sound Janet Collins made wasn't quite a scream, but it was close. "What are you talking about?" It turns out that expensive lawyers who don't work for 3 months while planning elaborate schemes against their neighbors tend to fall behind on their mortgage payments. The bank filed foreclosure proceedings this morning. You have 30 days to vacate. The room erupted in chaos, people talking over each other, phones buzzing with notifications, the careful social structure of the evening collapsing in real time. In the middle of it all, Michael stood frozen, finally understanding that his elaborate trap had become his own destruction. But I wasn't finished. "There's one more thing," I called out, raising my voice over the commotion. The room gradually quieted, everyone sensing that the worst was still to come. "Michael, do you remember what I taught you in the garage when you were 12? About how things that are broken don't have to stay that way?" He nodded mutely. "I was wrong. Some things, once they're broken, can never be fixed. Some betrayals are so complete, so calculated, that they destroy any possibility of redemption." I pulled out the final document Harold had prepared, the one that would hurt most of all. "This is my new will, filed this morning with the county clerk. Everything I own, the house, the property, the investments, everything your mother and I built together, is now going to the Veterans Administration Hospital, where your mother received her cancer treatment. Every penny." Sarah made a sound like air being let out of a balloon. Michael's face went through several different expressions before settling on something that looked like grief. "You spent months planning to steal my life, my independence, my dignity. You used my love for you as a weapon against me. You turned what should have been sacred, a wedding, a family celebration, into an instrument of cruelty." I folded the will and slipped it back into the folder. "So now you get to live with the consequences of those choices." I walked toward the front door, the crowd parting before me like water. At the threshold, I turned back one final time. "Enjoy your party, everyone. I hope it was everything you expected." Outside, the evening air felt sharp and clean. I sat in my truck for a moment, watching through the windows as the carefully planned celebration dissolved into chaos and recrimination. Phones were buzzing with notifications as the livestream plan backfired spectacularly, spreading not my humiliation, but Michael's across social media. By tomorrow, everyone in town would know what kind of man my son had become. The mortgage fraud investigation would begin, the foreclosure would proceed, and the restraining order would ensure they could never again threaten my independence. I'd won completely. So why did victory feel so much like grief? I drove home slowly, taking the long route past all the familiar landmarks of my life with Margaret. The park where we'd had picnics, the church where we'd been married, the little ice cream stand where we'd taken Michael when he was small. All of it felt different now, like I was seeing it through someone else's eyes. At home, I sat in Margaret's chair and looked at her photograph on the mantel. "It's over, Maggie," I said quietly. "He'll never hurt anyone like this again. But I don't think I'll ever see him again either." The house settled around me with its familiar sounds, but tonight they felt different. Not lonely exactly, but final, like the closing of a book that had taken 72 years to write. On the side table, next to Margaret's photograph, sat a single envelope that had been delivered while I was gone. My name was written on it in Michael's handwriting, his real handwriting this time, not the careful script of a fake invitation. I didn't open it. Whatever it said, apology, justification, plea for forgiveness, it was too late. Some bridges once burned couldn't be rebuilt. Some betrayals couldn't be forgiven, not because the heart wasn't willing, but because trust, once shattered so completely, could never be made whole again. Instead, I walked to the kitchen and made myself a cup of coffee, carrying it out to the back porch where Margaret and I used to sit on summer evenings. The November air was too cold for sitting outside, but I did it anyway, watching the stars emerge one by one in the clear sky. Tomorrow, Michael would begin dealing with the consequences of what he'd planned for me: the mortgage fraud investigation, the foreclosure, the social media catastrophe that would follow him for years. Sarah's parents would lose their house. Their marriage would probably not survive the stress and shame of what I'd revealed tonight. I'd destroyed them all completely and efficiently, using their own weapons against them. It should have felt like triumph. Instead, it felt like the end of everything I'd thought I knew about family, about love, about the boy I'd raised and the man he'd become. But it also felt like the beginning of something else, a different kind of peace, perhaps. The quiet that comes after a storm has passed, and the damage has been assessed, and you realize that you're still standing, still intact, still yourself, despite everything that was done to try to break you. I finished my coffee and went inside, checking the locks, turning off the lights, performing the small rituals that mark the end of another day. In the morning, I'd begin figuring out what came next for a 72-year-old man who just won a war he'd never wanted to fight. But tonight, I was exactly where I belonged, in the house Margaret and I had made into a home, surrounded by 40 years of real love and real memories. No one could take that away from me, no matter how hard they tried. The fake invitation still sat on my kitchen table, that cream-colored lie that had started all of this. I picked it up and walked to the fireplace Margaret had insisted on installing when we'd renovated the living room 20 years ago. I struck a match and watched the elegant cardstock catch fire, curling and blackening until it was nothing but ash. Some invitations, I'd learned, were never meant to be accepted, and some wars, once they were won, left you free to finally live in peace.